They're still at about 600 times earnings, but that's down.
With a PE ratio that sounds like a punchline, this company is far from a joke.
They're on a pace where they're likely to double earnings year over year. Palantir is not just meeting expectations, but they're beating expectations.
MarketBeat's Chris Markoch shares a new outlook on the Palantir valuation debate, plus an important warning for investors.
I've never said on this channel that Palantir is a tree that's just going to keep growing in the sky forever. There's going to probably be some pullbacks.
What investors should know about Palantir and other defense stocks this fall. Let's dive in. Chris, so great to have you back on the show today talking about one of everybody's favorite stocks, and that's Palantir. This stock down about 5% this last week, but overall still very near those all-time highs for this company. What's been happening with this stock recently?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing with the stock right now is really just a reaction to the broader market. I think whenever you're going to see some volatility in the market, a stock like Palantir, which is objectively expensive, is going to get laughed because that's where investors can go to get a lot of liquidity. And so I think it's reasonable to say that, yeah, Palantir is going to probably have a little bit of a slide when there's some concerns. Prior to Thursday of last week, when you got the good CPI news on Tuesday, Palantir was going up. But then I think when a lot of stocks retreated on Thursday, that was a logical reason for some investors to look to take some profits. And I think that's all you're really seeing with the stock right now.
Yeah, so not much in the story of the stock movement in this last week,
Correct.
But there is some new discussion on the age-old debate about Palantir's valuation.
Right.
Should you be getting into a stock with a PE of this rate right now?
I wrote an article for MarketBeat this past week, and one of the arguments that I made, and it's not an argument that I came up with myself, but we really have to start looking at digital-first companies such as Palantir and using a different measuring tool with them. Some of the metrics that they use to analyze like manufacturing stocks on a GAAP basis, those tools just don't necessarily translate really well to Palantir. And what it can do is it's going to create price to earnings multiples that are going to be quite large compared to what historical norms are for other companies. Does that account for all of Palantir's high PE ratio? No, but I think it does account for why it is so eye-poppingly big compared to some other companies.
Yeah, with a PE of a little more than 600 times earning, that gives any investor pause of, should we actually be adding to this company, waiting for that crash? I think that's the story with Palantir for so long, is everybody keeps waiting for this bubble to pop. But like you said, there is some debate about, is this actually a bubble, or is there evidence in the earnings, the really good earnings this company had just this quarter, that shows that the valuation might not be off by too much?
Right. And one of the things that I was looking at is, if you look at the company's earnings per share for all of fiscal year 2024, they came in at 31 cents per share. Already through the first 2 quarters of this fiscal year, Palantir's delivered 29 cents in total earnings per share. So they're on a pace where they're likely to double earnings year over year. And if they do that, that's going to continue to bring the PE ratio down quite a bit. And that will happen regardless of what happens with the stock price. So investors who are concerned about getting into Palantir because of the high PE ratio, what they really want to be paying attention to is what the company's earnings growth is going to be in the coming quarters, not necessarily what their revenue is going to be, although there's no reason to believe the revenue growth is going to take a tumble. It's just going to be, it's the earnings that you're going to want to look at.
Yeah, Palantir and really all of the AI stocks had a really great earnings season this year, just showing so much new growth and new investment into building out AI. And that has a lot of investors looking into some AI infrastructure plays. We have a really great article for you right now at MarketBeat. It's about the 5 ETFs that are really the hottest AI and energy infrastructure players right now. You can scan the QR code and click the the link in the description to get that full list of ETFs to look at right now on MarketBeat.com. And I know it's been a while since I've shared this with viewers, but you can also sign up for our SMS stock alerts by texting YouTube to 68285. That way you can get news articles like this one and stock alerts right to your phone. Well, Chris, let's get back to Palantir's earnings. I know the stock had a nice roughly $15 pop right after earnings were reported. What about this earnings report had investors so excited?
I think what's got investors excited, Bridget, is once again, Palantir is not just meeting expectations, but they're beating expectations. And they're beating expectations in many different ways. A lot of investors already knew that Palantir was going to have a lot of contract volume. But one number that stood out to me was the number of contracts that they're earning in the commercial sector and what that's done to contribute to the growth of the commercial sector over the past quarter. There's a lot of naysayers that are trying to say Palantir is a government-only story, that they're too reliant on government revenue. But when you really look at the numbers, yes, government revenue makes up about 53% of their revenue, but that's dramatically less than what it was like 2 years ago. So the company's really closing that gap with commercial revenue, and I think that's where investors are getting excited because the company's growth now is becoming organic, not to just the government side, but also to the commercial side.
Yeah, that commercial growth is very exciting. It shows that Palantir Technologies, that the products that they offer are resonating in many different areas. So that's a good sign for future growth. I do want to touch on the government contract side because one thing that we've talked about a lot over the last few months is all of that investment going into the defense sector right now. There's a lot of money going into this sector. Palantir is kind of the favored company for a lot of those contracts. But is that growth already priced in? Has that initial excitement already passed and we've seen the growth in these stocks because we knew that this investment was coming? Or is there still more room to grow as those contracts are actually awarded over the next few months and year?
I think that a lot of that growth is already priced into the stock, but I'm not sure if I would be willing to say all of it's priced in. Now, with the Defense Department trying to get leaner, will that mean some of those contracts will go away? So far, we're not really seeing evidence of that, at least not in the contracts that would impact Palantir in a significant way. The government is trying to get more efficient. The Defense Department's trying to get more efficient, but Palantir is actually a company that will help lean into that story, not necessarily take away from it, because Palantir is all about trying to help companies and governments and defense departments create efficiencies. So I'm not sure if I'm willing to say all of the growth is priced in, although I think you could say a significant amount is.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that the investment might come for Palantir because it's helping create those efficiencies. And we are seeing a huge budget for Department of Defense. Next year is supposed to be the first time Department of Defense has that near $1 trillion budget. So there's money going to this area, but it seems like the bulk of that investment is going towards these tech developments in defense and less on traditional defense equipment and machinery that you might have thought of in defense years ago. Are those companies seeing a pullback or not seeing the same benefit that Palantir is from all of this defense investment?
Yeah, I think what you're really seeing is the Defense Department is trying to move away from what you might say was the legacy tanks and the legacy missiles, and they're trying to create new defense systems. So I would look at this and say it might be similar to what went on in the 1980s when the US was trying to come up with new missile systems and new defense to upgrade our military then. I think this a similar approach is being tried now. And Palantir, by the way, has the US Army Titan contract. So that's tanks, but they're being tanks that are being done in a different way, and Palantir is providing the software for that. So again, I think this is a win for Palantir, and it's going to be a win for those defense companies that can lean into that new technology, which is why maybe some of the old names might not be doing as well this year, but why some of them may be poised to do very well in the coming years.
Yeah, the last month or two, we've been talking about defense stocks nonstop. Have we seen that growth yet? yet? Are we starting to see a pullback? Did they grow too big too fast? Just kind of talking about the whole defense sector in general. What are we seeing there?
My take on this is I think it's impossible right now to talk about the defense sector without also tying in the space sector. I think these two sectors right now are joined at the hip. I think you're looking at drones. I think you're looking at autonomous. I think you're looking at a company like Rocket Lab, to be honest, that maybe isn't thought of as a traditional defense player, but I think now is getting into that ecosystem. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here. I think investors want to be somewhat careful. Again, I don't think you want to not have exposure to some of the big names, but I think where the real growth is going to be coming from is some of these smaller name companies. And we've had a lot of those people on the channel so far in the past couple of months, Bridget. I know you have. You've been interviewing those people, almost every week.
Yeah, there's always a new defense name to talk about. And that brings us to the smaller companies. Palantir continues to see the growth. It continues to see the higher valuation and just has a lot of investors excited about it. But the other defense player that, many thought was going to be a competitor for Palantir is Big Bear AI. And they're not seeing the same growth. In fact, they saw one of the biggest drops we've seen in a while. What's the story there? Why is Big Bear not getting the same investment in the defense sector that Palantir is seeing?
If you look at their earnings report, what happened with Big Bear is Big Bear said that some of the contracts that they were expecting to see on the government side are being held up. It doesn't necessarily mean they won't get those contracts. It just means that they didn't see that revenue in the last quarter and they're not forecasting getting it for the coming quarters. I think the story with Big Bear is what I was just pointing out with Palantir. Big Bear isn't really entrenched on the commercial side. The opportunity with Big Bear really looks to be almost exclusively on the defense side. I think it was really just a case of they didn't hit their numbers. And you're looking at a period of time where I remember back in the .com era where if you had .com in your name and you weren't making money, it wasn't a good thing. And right now, Big Bear has AI in its name and it didn't hit on its earnings, and I think that's why it's getting punished. Is there a long-term outcome for Big Bear? Possibly. I'm not going to sit here and shoot down the stock. I haven't studied it as closely as I've studied Palantir, but what I can tell you is one of my least favorite sports debates is something is the next something, and I think it applies to stocks very well too. I think the idea that BBAI is the next Palantir, it's unfair to BBAI. Palantir doesn't really care, but I think it's unfair to BBAI. I think the stock has a future, but I think the future is not going to be quite what Palantir's is, and that could still be okay for investors. I just think they have to put it in context. It's a smaller company. I think the growth can be there, but I don't think the growth is going to be what Palantir's is.
And it's hard to replicate the kind of growth that Palantir has had because it's been an incredible growth story over the past year or two, really. A lot of our viewers, they got in on Palantir early.
Yeah.
Many people bought in around that $20 mark, the $30 mark, and now we're up in that $160, $170 mark. One thing I want to talk about is adding to your Palantir position. That's the question a lot of investors have. Or when to sell? Should I be cashing in on some of this? Are we going to see a pullback soon? So let's start with the when to sell and get some cash in Palantir. Maybe some investors have already done that, but what's your thoughts on raising some cash right now with where Palantir still is in the market?
I always have to start these conversations with saying, we're not trying to give financial advice here. You want to talk to your financial professionals and you want to be doing your own due diligence on this. Having said that, I think it's perfectly reasonable and rational that you would have some investors who have been in Palantir for quite a while. It's perfectly rational to take some profit off the table right now. Again, nobody ever got broke taking a profit. And if you were in Palantir when it was in the single digits, and some investors have been in Palantir since it was below $10 a share, it's perfectly reasonable to take some of that money off the table and say, you know what, I made my profit and I'm letting the rest of that money ride in the investment. On the other hand, I'll take another approach and say, if this is money that you've got in your portfolio that you don't believe you're going to have to access for another 3 to 5 years or longer, and you believe that Palantir could easily double, if not go higher from where it is, in that time, then you might just want to say, you know what, I'm going to stick with the stock. For Palantir stock to drop 30%, 40% from where it's at, would not necessarily be considered out of line. There's going to probably be some pullbacks. There already was one at the start of this year. But I think that if you're an investor right now, it's absolutely reasonable that you might want to take some profit. And then I can also make an argument for saying, yeah, you just want to buy and hold it.
Yeah, it's a good advice for people who already own Palantir. But talking about the adding to the position, I want to get back to the pullback theory on Palantir, that a pullback is very possible. We just had Mark Chaikin on the channel last week, and Palantir was his first pick. If there is a slowdown in September or early October, that Palantir is the first company he would buy on a pullback. And I think his target point was wait for a 10 to 15% drop. And that would put it around, 150 as a buy-in point for Palantir. What are your thoughts on when is a good time to add to a Palantir position? What should you be watching for if you're waiting to add more to your Palantir?
Yeah, you know what? I think Mark makes a great point there, because that would be pretty much right in line with where I would say you want to be looking to add. We've already shown it's dropped about 5% in this past week. If that sell-off becomes a little bit more pronounced and you start seeing it lose 5% more and maybe 10%, and it starts getting around that 10 to 15% range, yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting buying point. And I don't think it's necessarily just a buying point for new investors, but I think you're going to start seeing some of that other retail money, some of those retail investors who have been waiting. I think they're going to be looking at that as a buying opportunity, because there are many analysts that are already starting to say Palantir hitting $200 in the next 12 months is their new price target. So, you start getting that stock around 166. Now, all of a sudden, there's some attractive upside there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a good caveat to say this pullback wouldn't be because of any Palantir fundamentals. It's more so market trends. What's happening in
Yes.
the market? Are we going to see the market slow down or pull back a little bit? And if Palantir goes along with the market, this company would be one of the first on the list to buy if we see that overall market trend of a slowdown. Again,
Yeah.
nothing to do with Palantir's fundamentals.
No. I think you're starting to see, a little bit lighter volume right now. So some of the sell-off right now is being triggered because there's less volume. What'll be interesting to see is what happens when we get into September and there's going to be more volume coming in from the institutions. That's why I'm saying investors might see Palantir drop a little bit more, because you could see some selling pressure on it from fund managers that are going to be looking to reallocate their portfolios for that last quarter of the year. And so they might be looking to take a little profit from Palantir and put it in some other sectors. And that's okay. But I do think that if you're looking, again, as a long-term play, yeah, if you get a 10 to 15% pullback on Palantir right now, that's a time to be looking to buy.
All really good advice and a good discussion on Palantir. Thank you so much for always talking about the stock and following the stock for us, Chris, so we can give our viewers an update. I know it's a company a lot of our viewers care about, they have in their portfolio, and they want to stay up to date on. Let us know what you think about Palantir in the comments. Do you think that a pullback could be possible in the next couple of months? Do you think it could shoot even higher by the end of the year? We'd love to hear your thoughts on how this company could finish out 2025. Thank you again for watching, everyone. And as always, happy investing.